On this episode of Things That Matter, I'm interviewing Pastor Justin Thomas of Calvary, the Hill in Seattle. And we're talking about Seattle and ministry there, and we're focusing a bit on the LGBT issue. That's an area that God's really put on Justin's heart. So stay tuned, and I know you're going to enjoy it. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Things That Matter. I'm your host, Brian Brodersen, and it's great to be with you today. And I have as my guest in the studio my friend Justin Thomas from Seattle, Washington. Justin, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Justin is the pastor of a church in downtown Seattle called Calvary of the Hill, which is Capitol Hill, right?
Yep.
So that's great. I mean, having a church right in the heart of a city, and a city like Seattle, which is a pretty progressive city here in the U.S., obviously, right? So Justin, just give us a little bit of, personal background.
Sure.
How you got to where you're at today. And then let's talk a little bit, too, about why you have a church in a place like Capitol Hill.
Yeah. So I actually grew up in the Northwest, but not in the Seattle area, but on the other side of the mountains in central Washington. Okay. And so I got saved in a Calvary chapel right in my hometown of Yakima, but pretty late in my high school experience, and was already set up to go to Central Washington University. And then while I was there, discovered that we had a Bible college, and I knew what a seminary was, but I'd never heard of a Bible college. And I started listening online because I had some friends who were attending, and I realized that's what I needed. That's where I needed to be. So I came down to Marietta for a year, and then while I was down here, all of my family ended up moving to the Seattle area, and that's when I discovered that Wayne Taylor and his son Jordan had started a school there in Seattle, and no offense, but I realized there was no future for me in California. It wasn't for me. And so the opportunity to finish my education in a place where I knew I wanted to end up and start to transition. I met my wife down here in California, so I had no job, no plans, no local church, and the Bible college in Seattle kind of provided all of that.
Yeah.
And then I went on to work with Wayne for a couple of years on staff there. And then in 2010, we planted in the Capitol Hill neighborhood.
Okay. So is your wife a Californian, or is she?
Yeah, she's from down here, actually, from Ontario.
Okay. So you do have some connection.
I do, yeah.
Are you warming up? Are you warming up a little bit?
I love it in small doses. So
that's how we feel about the Northwest.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay, so Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
When you say Capitol Hill, I know what you mean because I've spent time on Capitol Hill, but what is that? What is Capitol Hill?
Yeah, so the neighborhood itself is just up the hill from downtown proper, and it's the densest populated neighborhood in Seattle right now. It's only about 4 square miles, but it's almost 60,000 people, and the back half of it is where all the wealth is, and so it's really just 2 square miles and most of that 60,000 people. Okay. So it's very densely populated. We've got both a central community college for Seattle there and Seattle University, which is a Jesuit school that's pretty well known. And so it's very educated. There's a lot of the arts presence there, and a lot of the old bars and clubs where the grunge scene happened. That's all in Capitol Hill.
Right.
And then it's historically been the gay neighborhood in Seattle. As you mentioned, Seattle's very progressive, so that's spread out, but it's still kind of the home, and it's where the entire LGBT community kind of comes back to for their celebrations and such.
Yeah. So why are you there?
The biggest reason, I think, was because under Wayne's ministry, he's been in the Seattle area for a long time now, and we started realizing that the border between the city proper and outside the city was getting a lot bigger. And so we would invite people to church up 20 minutes north of Seattle, and they had no way to get there.
Right.
And the city was booming again, and so people were flowing in and churches were flowing out. And so we collectively have planted 3 new churches in the city proper in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And Capitol Hill made the list because for all of the people it has, the church presence has always been relatively small.
Yeah.
In fact, it's only gotten smaller since we've been there the last 8 years. And so there was a lot of people there, and then as far as I'm concerned, I really wanted something with a bit of education, something that was culturally relevant. And Capitol Hill is very much a gateway to the city.
Yeah.
It's a fountainhead of culture, and it's also the place where everybody lives for a while. And so to reach the rest of this Seattle, we basically just camped ourselves at the gate of the city.
Yeah. It's an interesting place, and I've been there a number of times, and it's where you got great coffee, you got cool art stuff, like you said. You walk around at night, there's bands, music all over the place. But I remember even years ago, the streets are the crosswalks are rainbows, and every third shop is was a gay something or other, and so it's really an interesting cultural mix there.
It's always been a place for sexual misfits, and all of the issues that the church has been wrestling with for the last 15 years are not issues for me. They're actual neighbors. They're my baristas and co-workers of people in my church, and so that's a major component of the neighborhood. And it's actually, if you're not used to it, a little jarring because it's so visible and so present. And actually, to be fair, that's where a lot of the value in the neighborhood comes from. It was really on its way down, and the gay community was looking for a home, and they've really cultivated this space that has now drawn all of these non-LGBT people into it. They really built the home. We just live there.
And they tend to do that, don't they? I mean, they go in and they gentrify, or whatever term you want to use, but they create some cool spaces that people just like, wow, this is a cool spot. I want to come here. But you said that over the years, the church presence has actually been decreasing. Do you connect those two things, the growth of the
there's
LGBT
a part of that,
thing
and so there's really, when we got there were really two types of churches. There were churches that owned a building there and had history there, but had moved on and were just commuting in, and the buildings were locked Monday through Friday. There were bars on the windows. Being as urban as we are, there's a lot of the other difficulties, a lot of homeless, a lot of crime, a little bit of danger. And so there's those churches, and then there's the churches that have become open and affirming. But even they don't really connect with the neighborhood anymore, and they're commuters. And so the Christian presence, the evangelical presence, was almost nil. With very little exception. Redeemer planted a church there. Redeemer Presbyterian in New York planted a church there in the 90s that is still doing really well.
On the hill.
On the hill, they're called Grace Presbyterian, and they're a really neat church. Got some good stuff going on. And then there's just a handful of us, and even in that midst, the turnover in the last 3 years, both because of these issues and because of the other issues of being in the city, have just been tremendous.
Now just talking about Seattle, just kind of more generally for a minute, I hear these statistics that Seattle is one of the most unchurched cities in the country. Right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we're still up there. We actually have a very strong number of Christian nonprofit organizations and other things. We're pretty high on the rank. So there's a great national ministry called Discovery Institute. And they function out of Seattle, but they don't really function in Seattle. It's just their headquarters, and there's a lot of things like that. When Mars Hill was really on the rise in Seattle, and Mark Driscoll, that drew a lot of attention to Seattle, and so there's been a lot of church planting. But I mean, I only have my own experience to gauge, but it seems like a large number of those have folded and disappeared over the time, and so I would say there's plenty of work.
So you and I, we know each other. We've talked over the years, and there has been for you specifically a burden for the LGBT community. And so how do you find ministry taking place there where you're located? Do you feel like you're making progress, developing relationships? Is there any Do you see, any kind of openness with people, or
Yeah.
just kind of give us a picture of that?
It's a really difficult thing. When we got there, we realized that the neighborhood kind of wrote first impression in Sharpies, and if we made a misstep, we were going to live under that misstep for years to come. And even within a couple of years of us planting, a couple of years prior, a church had been run out of the neighborhood for handling these things poorly. And then
So run out, what does run out mean?
Well, so what happened specifically, we have The Stranger, which is a very liberal newspaper, 2 blocks from our church, stationed right there. Dan Savage, who's their sex advice columnist. I mean, he's a national name now.
Sure.
And so they sent in an interviewer to just sit in on a service of this church and then interview the pastor, published it, and then the neighborhood basically went to their landlord and said, we will not utilize your business if you host this church. And so they moved out of the neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, that is driven out. Right there.
Right. Yeah. And it was probably a place where these things burned really hot during the AIDS epidemic. Cal Anderson Park is across the street from our church. That was a Washington state senator who died of AIDS and was part of the LGBT community there in Capitol Hill. And so cackles are still a little high, but the arguments are somewhat burned over. And so when we went in, we wanted to really take some time to get to know our neighbors. Kind of the vision that I laid out is if a day comes and there's a protest out front, as our congregation is breaking through the protest, I want them to recognize people in our congregation. I want them to go, wait a minute, he comes into my shop all the time.
Yeah. I
never wanted get out of our neighborhood to stick. I wanted to say, but this is our neighborhood. We are us. We're here. And then the other thing was, when we got there, very dissatisfied with much of what I was seeing in the church's response, and not just in like the front end nightly news type stuff, but even in the deeper thinking. There was a lot of stuff, what I would say, on the front lines of the battlefield, but there wasn't a lot of deep thinking going on. It didn't drive us back to the Bible's big theology of sex and what it's about. And so personally, I took quite a few years to study really deeply and think through things. And I didn't teach on sex and gender proper until this fall, 7 years in. And so we taught through Romans, we taught through 1 Corinthians. We always address these things when they come up. And I've had a multitude of conversations with inquirers, with people on the street who want to know about the church, with people in our church. There's really not a version of the LGBT issue we haven't encountered. Gay married Christians who come and say, are we welcome here? People who are struggling with same-sex attraction and hold a traditional view and want support for that. People who have never told anyone that they deal with that, who came with us on our planning team and then had a year in went, we should talk about this because I've never told anyone. Wow. So we've seen all versions of it, but it kind of came to a head, if you will, this last fall with a big series, a sermon series.
We talked. You told me you were going to do that series. How did it go?
It was really good. It had a lot of positive and a lot of difficulty, and the nature of the series, like I said, I didn't want to talk about the issues, and so the series was really about the why of a Christian sexual ethic, and focusing in on this fact that every time Paul deals with gender or sex, when Jesus talks about it in Matthew 19, when Malachi talks about divorce, they all go to Genesis 2. Every single time. 7 different passages, all of the big ones go to Genesis 2. And so there's something about God's creation design that defines sexual ethic. All Christian ethics are symbolic in nature. We do what we do because of who God is. But sex is even closer because it's right next to that idea of being created in God's image. And so right there, Genesis 1:27, he made them in the image of God, male and female.
Right.
And then the first thing he tells them is be fruitful and multiply. Yeah. And then Jesus says, if you want to understand my ministry, you have to understand marriage. And John picks up that image and says, we're all headed towards a great marriage. And so these things are not on the fringes of a Christian ethic. They're at the heart of what it means to be human. And so they're at the heart of what it means to be a Christian, to follow Jesus, to represent God and be in his image.
Yeah. So we've got the one church that got driven out of town.
Sure, yeah.
You guys obviously haven't been driven out yet.
Yeah.
You're still there. What's the response? I'm sure it's mixed, probably.
It is.
Right?
It is mixed, but I will say honestly, for the most part, in the face-to-face conversations we've had, even in the email conversations of inquirers, it's been really good. And I'll just give you one example. So, when DOMA was overturned down here in California, it was one of the hottest weeks of the summer up in Washington, and they were having quite a few celebratory renewal of vow type ceremonies in the park across from the church, and everybody was looking for water and restrooms. And we were setting up the church. It was a Sunday, and there was a transgender couple who came in to use the restroom. And so while one of them was in the restroom, I was talking with this transgender man, and he said, "Are you guys a tolerant church?" And I've learned this from Timothy Keller, and so I just responded. I said, "Well, it depends on how you define tolerance." I said, if you want to know that we'll already outright agree with everything you are and everything you do, or that we'll keep that to ourselves, then no, we're probably not a tolerant church. I said, but if you want to know if you can come here as you are, and that we'll respect you even though you differ from us, and that we can talk about these things, then I'd say yes. And he leaned forward and he said, honestly, I think if more churches said what you just said, more of us would be at church.
Wow.
And for the most part, that's what we've seen.
Yeah.
And there's been some difficult things. You know, we have had to come to a differing of opinion and a parting of ways. We've had to draw the line in the sand.
Yeah.
But like Jesus, we've tried to leave room so people can hear the gospel and then recognize that time to draw the line, like he does with the rich young ruler.
Yeah.
And even to do that in a way that's not just loving, but recognizes the story isn't over.
Yeah.
You know, and so basically say we're still here.
Yeah.
We're going to be here.
Yeah.
That's been, I think, a primary component of our church is just permanence.
Yeah. So have you seen people come to faith out of that lifestyle?
We have, not specifically on Sunday mornings, but quite a few times we felt like the triage. And so I remember a man in particular who came to our church, and he was HIV positive, had lived in the neighborhood and in the gay lifestyle for all of his adult life, and had just started drinking himself to death. Developed some real stomach problems that made it hard to leave the house, and he was just downward spiral. And he remembered who Jesus was from his childhood, and he just began to cry out and pray. And one morning he woke up, his desire to drink was gone, his stomach didn't hurt, and he said, Jesus must have done this. And so he called one of the only Christians he knew and said, what do I do now? And she said, you get baptized. Yeah. And so he was walking by our church with that same person a few weeks later, and she said, why don't you check out that church? Yeah. And so he came, introduced himself, and we kind of picked up right there.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's been very common for us to have people in our church who are Christians but have been unwilling to engage this part of their struggle. Yeah. And so we've seen a lot of that. And then I would say this is part of being in the city too, but the turnover of our church is pretty abnormal. I mean, I always tell people we're an 80-person church that loses 50 people a year. Yeah. You know, and we're still here. We replenish. Yeah. But it's made us embrace being a smaller part of people's stories. Yeah. You know, I'm not going to be a pastor who gets to baptize, marry, and bury. And so because of that, we appreciate all of the little conversions on the way to conversion. Yeah. Yeah. We appreciate coming alongside people for that first year of being a Christian and laying a foundation. Yeah. Yeah. And so in terms of that, have we seen people who were, you know, going from hostility to Christianity to curious? Have we seen the curious ride along with us and engage with the truth for themselves? Have we seen people willing to press into these things and be honest and look at them afresh? Absolutely, all the time. Yeah, yeah.
And of course, it's not exclusively LGBT.
No, not at all. In fact,
population, right?
Whatever it used to be a decade ago, it's like it's been diluted. Yeah. People have just been flowing in so quickly, and so it's hard to tell what's still there. But it is a major component. And the thing is, in our world now, if it's not your issue, it's your family member's issue, it's your coworker's issue.
Yeah. And of course, you know, kind of just with the transient nature of your people coming and, you know, only being there briefly. Of course, you know, I pastored in a large city in London. And that's, in some ways, it's kind of the nature of a city. You know, you just have people that are they're there for a season. I mean, obviously people live there too, but a lot of people are just there for a year or two. And I found in my experience that people would come, and I remember specifically one guy came, and I don't think I ever even really met him. I just see him on Sundays, and after a couple of years, he came up and just thanked me, said, I've been here for 2 years on a work contract, and I've learned more about the Bible than I've ever known in my life from being here, and now I'm going back to my country. I'm taking everything that you taught me, and I'm going to go share it with my people. It's like, wow, amazing,
Ray Bakke, who's kind of an urban Christian thinker, he talks about the fact that where the big cities are, it's like a mission field, but on the inverse.
Yeah.
And so the nations come to us.
That's right.
And we see that really extensively. And one of the interesting things is churches are so rare in Seattle, and especially non-denominational ones.
Yeah.
We get people who identify as Christians from all backgrounds.
Yeah, right.
And that makes preaching basically every Sunday is apologetic for me, because
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to agree on theories of atonement, on eschatology. I don't even know if we're going to agree on what it means to be saved.
Yeah.
And those are for the people who identify as Christians,
Yeah.
But one of the great things is you start to realize, man, you can just, as Mike Doyle told me one time, he's at Movement in Manhattan, he just said, you just touch as many lives as they float past this big city of River
right.
City, as they go by.
Yeah.
And that's really been kind of our anthem, to just leave people further along the path than when we found them.
Yeah.
And
great.
it's generally encouraging, actually.
Yeah, and in some ways, I mean, sometimes I think we get locked into a mentality like, well, it's got to look like this, but God has people that are just, one plants, one waters.
Yeah.
God gives the increase. Sometimes you're planting the seed, sometimes you're watering the seed somebody else has planted. Sometimes you get the joy of harvesting and even enjoying that fruit through discipleship or whatever. And of course, we all know now that this isn't just limited to these kinds of environments like you're in at Capitol Hill. I mean, this is everywhere. It's everywhere because of the ubiquitous nature of the internet, which is everywhere. And so, where there was a time and a place where that you were kind of sheltered, or you were kind of, oh no, we've never met anybody like that. Oh, no, it's kind of not the case anymore.
Right. And the truth is, that's really good. So I talked with a man in his late 50s who, once again, had lived out his adult life in our neighborhood in the gay community, and then came back to the Lord. And I was talking with him, and he said, frankly, Justin, I've never met a gay man who didn't grow up in the church.
Wow.
And I think that was the first misstep the church made, was thinking this was out there, when it was in our youth groups, it was in our marriages, and we didn't give any room or context for that stuff to be safely brought forward and dealt with. And so, no surprise, they left and went elsewhere.
So, okay, in our last couple minutes here, what do you want to say to other guys who are in the ministry, pastoring, where because there's still, I mean, there are guys that are they get it. They through whatever, through location or through friendships, they get it. But there's still a lot of people out there that do not get how do we even navigate this? And you've thought a lot about that.
I think it's a couple of things. One is, we need to see it and address it as an us issue. When the AIDS epidemic broke out in the 80s, where was the church? And the reason, I think, and I hate to say this because this is my family, but I think it's because it was their issue. The bubonic plague, Luther's like, no, I'm staying in Wittenberg with my people. And we've been there on the front lines of every other issue, but this one, we saw it as being a them issue. And I just think that plural pronoun we is the heart of ministry. As long as it's them, it may be benevolent, but it's arrogant, all of these things. And so that's the first thing, and we have to address it that way, as if we're talking to people in our congregations, and not just an issue that's on the nightly news or burning across the internet. And then another one is, there's a lot of issues that exacerbate the problem that we've got to get straight. You know, we've lost a solid theology of the body. And so when people come to us and say it's who's inside that matters, not what's on the outside, that's our fault. That's our Gnosticism that we've been preaching forever. You know, we've got to remember and restore those things. We've got to stop making marriage a primary part of Christian maturity. There has to be a possibility, not just to be single in the church, but to be, like Paul says, a good life, a viable option. And so we've got to learn to be a family for the familyless again, you know. And then I think another thing is we have to recognize the complexity of the issue, that we need to preach what the Bible says and call for truth at one level, but we also need to love our neighbor. And if your only way of interacting with the gay community right now is in the voter's box, you're not loving your neighbor, you know. And then there's the people in our actual lives, and we have to figure out what it looks like to walk alongside them, to love and support them.
And you know, most people I know that have come out of the lifestyle have come out because two things. Either just a sovereign intervention of God, like the guy you described, who wakes up one morning and he's not drinking and his stomach doesn't hurt.
Right.
And I've heard many of those stories, you know. Or it's relational.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just, you know, this person took the time to reach out to me, to love me, and in a sense, not even with an agenda, but just genuinely. And that's the impact. I remember talking to one guy who was actually, you know, quite an activist in his day in the gay movement. And when he was telling me about how he came, you know, out of that and into faith, he talked about these people that just basically came alongside, befriended him, loved him, and never once mentioned his. And he said, at a point I wondered, did they even know? But then he realized later, they knew, but they didn't make it an issue. And they loved him to Jesus without ever addressing his sexuality. The Lord addressed the sexuality when he came.
And that's the thing is, it's not the first question, you know, and we need to figure out what it looks like to be a church that has gay non-Christians who feel comfortable coming and hearing about Jesus. We have to figure that out. But at the same time, a lot of churches are choosing to make this a non-issue, or they're biting their tongue on the issue, and it's wreaking the same havoc, because you can't support either side, the affirming side or the ones who are struggling with, if you don't deal with it. And so, in my opinion, we need to talk more, not less. There's so much more the Bible says to people dealing with these issues than we generally say. But to backpedal because of the heat is the wrong direction. Man, thanks for coming on. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the conversation. Good. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And as always, we pray that this has been helpful, and encourage you to share it with others as you as the Lord ministers to you through it. Just pass it on, and we'll look forward to being with you next time. God bless you.